I want to start with a number because it explains more about pensioner tax than almost anything else this year. £22. That's it. That's now the entire gap between the full new state pension and the personal allowance. The point where income tax starts, the state pension has crept up so close to that threshold that it's practically touching it. And that matters more than people realize. Because once your state pension alone uses up nearly your whole tax-free allowance, absolutely everything else you receive, a private pension, part-time earnings, even ordinary interest on your savings, has nowhere left to hide. It's taxable from the first pound. Nobody's going to send you a letter explaining this. HMRC won't. Your building society won't either. So let's go through it properly, step by step. And I'll finish with one allowance that a huge number of people watching this could be using right now and simply aren't. Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now because every week I cover the real financial information that affects seniors directly. The rules that change, the protections you already qualify for, and the steps that actually make a difference. This is exactly the kind of content I put out every single week, and you do not want to miss it. Now let's get into it. This whole corner of the tax system tends to stay invisible right up until a bill turns up. And by then, the year it applies to has already gone. First, let's untangle two things that get mixed up constantly. There's the personal allowance, and there's the personal savings allowance. Similar names, completely different jobs, and this confusion catches out more people than anything else in this topic. A lot of people assume that because their total income sits under that £12,570 threshold, their savings interest is automatically untouched. That's not necessarily true. The personal savings allowance stands apart from all of this. It lets a basic rate taxpayer earn £1,000 of interest a year with no tax owed on it. For a higher rate taxpayer, that allowance is only £500. And here's the detail worth noting. It hasn't moved since it was introduced back in 2016, while savings rates have climbed a long way since then. Let's put real numbers against it. At today's typical savings rates, call it around 4.5%, someone with £22,000 tucked away is roughly at the ceiling of that £1,000 allowance already. Push that to £50,000 in savings, and you're generating something like £2,250 in interest a year. The first £1,000 is sheltered. The rest, roughly £1,250, is taxable, and HMRC takes 20% of it, about £250. At £100,000 saved, you're looking at around £4,500 in interest, with roughly £3,500 of that taxable, and a bill near £700 a year purely on savings income. Manageable for now perhaps, but the direction of travel matters, and it's about to get steeper, which I'll come back to. Now back to that £22 gap, because it's the real story here. The personal allowance has been frozen at £12,570 for years, and the government has confirmed that freeze runs on further still. Meanwhile, the state pension rises every April under the triple lock. This year, it went up by 4.8%, taking the full new state pension to £241.30 a week, which works out at roughly £12,548 annually. Put those two side by side, and the gap that used to give pensioners breathing room has all but vanished. A rise like that next year, and the state pension could overtake the personal allowance outright, meaning anyone receiving the full amount becomes a taxpayer with no other income needed whatsoever, just from their pension alone. This is how tax rises without a single announcement. Thresholds stay put, incomes edge upward, and more of what you receive quietly slides into taxable territory. It rarely makes headlines, but it adds up. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Margaret. She's in her mid-70s, widowed a few years back, and after a working life of careful budgeting, had around £75,000 sitting in a building society account. A letter arrived from HMRC saying she owed a few £100 in tax. She'd never had a tax bill before and assumed, reasonably enough, that nobody telling her otherwise meant her savings were simply safe. What Margaret hadn't been told is this. Every bank and building society reports the interest they pay you straight to HMRC automatically, every year, not when you declare it, not if you're asked, automatically. Her account had paid out interest that pushed well past her £1,000 allowance, and HMRC knew before she did. How they collect it depends on the size of the bill. Smaller amounts are usually recovered by quietly adjusting your tax code, so your pension arrives a little lighter than expected, and you might not even notice. Larger amounts trigger a formal demand called a simple assessment, with a set deadline. If one of these ever lands and the figures look off, ask your bank for a year-end interest statement and compare it against what HMRC has recorded. The two don't always line up, and if they don't, you have grounds to query it. Worth knowing too, neither route requires you to have done anything wrong to trigger it. HMRC gathers interest data from every bank and building society each year, matches it against your tax code, and adjusts accordingly, often months after the tax year in question is already closed. That's why the first sign of a problem is usually a smaller pension payment or an unexpected letter, rather than anything you actually declared or failed to declare. Now here's the part that genuinely frustrates me, because it's real money and almost nobody knows it exists. There's a third allowance, separate again from the two above, called the starting rate for savings. If your income from everything other than savings, your pension, any earnings, rental income, comes to less than £17,570 a year, you can receive up to £5,000 of savings interest completely tax-free. Not reduced, not discounted. Zero tax. That £17,570 figure is simply the £12,570 personal allowance with a £5,000 band sitting on top. There's a taper. For every pound your non-savings income goes above £12,570, the band shrinks by a pound, and it disappears entirely once you reach £17,570. But for a great many retirees whose income is mostly the state pension, plus a modest top-up, a meaningful slice of this band sits unused every single year. Take someone I'll call Alan. He draws a full state pension plus a small workplace pension, bringing his total pension income to around £13,500. His savings pay him £3,800 in interest. For the past 2 years, he's paid tax on part of that because he was told his allowance was £1,000 and left it there. But look properly. His pension income sits about £950 above the personal allowance, so his starting rate band shrinks from £5,000 to roughly £4,050, comfortably covering his £3,800 of interest. His actual tax bill on savings? Nothing. His £1,000 personal savings allowance was never even needed. He'd been handing HMRC money it was never owed, simply because nobody had laid the numbers out for him. For anyone drawing only the state pension with no other income at all, the position is even better. Stack the full £5,000 starting rate band on top of the £1,000 personal savings allowance, and you could hold something in the region of £130,000 in an ordinary savings account before a penny of tax falls due on the interest at typical current rates. If you think you've overpaid because this band should have applied to you, Form R40 is free on the government's website and lets you claim back recent years. That's your money. Go and get it. It's worth double checking this even if you're fairly confident your income is straightforward, because the starting rate band is easy to overlook precisely because it sits between two better-known allowances. A modest workplace pension, A small annuity or even a part-time job can nudge non-savings income just over the personal allowance without anyone realizing the knock-on effect on savings tax. And that knock-on effect is exactly what caught Alan out for 2 years running. Now, the change is on the way because they matter and they don't arrive alone. The first is confirmed in the autumn budget and written into the Finance Act. From April 2027, the tax rate on savings interest above your allowances rises by 2 percentage points across the board. Basic rate moves from 20% to 22%, higher rate from 45% to 42%, and the additional rate from 45% to 47%. This applies right across the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland alike, since savings income tax isn't devolved. On £3,000 of taxable interest, that's roughly an extra £60 a year for a basic rate taxpayer. Not huge on its own, but permanent, and it lands alongside a second, quieter change. At the moment, where your income comes from several sources, HMRC applies your personal allowance in whichever way leaves you paying the least tax overall. From April 2027, that flexibility disappears. The allowance will have to be set first against earnings and pension income, and only whatever's left over, which for someone on a full state pension plus a workplace pension may be very little, can then be used against savings interest. Combine the two changes and the effect compounds. More of your savings income falls into the taxable band, and it's taxed at a higher rate once it does. Here's the good news, and it's aimed squarely at the people watching this. Interest earned inside a cash ISA sits completely outside all of this. None of the allowance limits touch it. None of the coming rate rises apply to it. And it isn't even reported to HMRC because there's simply nothing to report. There is a change coming to ISAs too, and it cuts the other way for older savers. From April 2027, the amount under 65s can put into a cash ISA each year drops to £12,000, with the remaining £8,000 of the £20,000 overall ISA allowance steered towards stocks and shares investments instead. But, and this is written directly into the policy, anyone aged 65 or over keeps the full £20,000 cash ISA allowance every year, no reduction at all. In a set of changes that mostly works against ordinary savers in retirement, this one is a genuine exception in your favor. Picture a couple I'll call Frank and Joan, both in their late 60s, with £100,000 between them in an ordinary savings account earning around 4.5%, roughly £4,500 a year in interest. Their combined personal savings allowances cover £1,500 of that, leaving the rest taxable. Now picture the same couple moving that money into cash ISAs instead, using £20,000 each this year and the balance over following years. Once it's inside the ISA wrapper, that interest is tax-free every year afterwards, regardless of what happens to rates or thresholds down the line. Same pension, same savings, same couple. The only difference is which account the money sits in. Keep repeating that each April, and within a handful of years, the bulk of a household's savings can sit entirely outside the reach of the changes we've just gone through, regardless of what future budgets decide to do with rates or thresholds. So, pulling this together, the personal allowance and the state pension have almost merged into one figure, meaning far more retirees are becoming taxpayers with no other income at all. Your bank tells HMRC about your interest automatically, whether you expect it or not. The starting rate for savings is sitting unused for a great many people who'd qualify. From April 2027, savings tax rates rise and the allowance rules tighten, but cash ISAs, especially for the over 65s, remain a genuine shelter from nearly all of it. The single most useful thing you can do this week is check whether the starting rate band already covers your interest. And if you've got savings sitting outside an ISA, start moving what you can into one, using your own allowance and your partner's too, if you have one, before another tax year slips by unused. One last thing, because it matters here more than almost anywhere else. I've spent my working life around money and tax, but I'm not your personal advisor, and nothing here is advice tailored to your situation. The right answer depends entirely on your own income and savings. For anything more involved, speak to a qualified accountant, a regulated financial advisor, or book a free session through PensionWise via Money Helper. Citizens' advice can help with the practical side too, and none of it costs you anything.